House prices tumble and it's going to get worse. Gas producers told to boost supply to help households. And 15% of white-collar workers may never go back to the office. It's Tuesday, the 2nd of August, 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael. Now, it's the 2nd of the month. So we always have, it's always pretty exciting, the beginning of the month for us here at Fear and Greed, because we work out how we went the previous month in terms of downloads.
That's right. And this was a pretty spectacular month, July was. It's not very modest of us to say this, is it? But if we don't, nobody will. So someone has to talk about this kind of thing. More than 600,000 downloads across Fear and Greed and the Fast Five, which is our shorter kind of headlines podcast.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, we're really grateful to everyone who's been listening. But really, in this last month, what we're seeing is people kind of spreading the word, kind of telling a colleague or a family member or someone else about Fear and Greed. And that is just so important, so useful, and just kind of helps us get the word out there about Fear and Greed. So thank you very much.
That's the message. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your colleagues. The more, the merrier.
Absolutely. Now, immediately after the show today, you've got an interview with Brendan Malone from Raise Invest. This is a good one.
Yes, we have a great chat to Brendan about Ray's business model, which is all about, there's many aspects to it, but we take a bit of a deep dive into the idea where you can round up purchases and kind of create a pool of money which you can then invest. Very innovative, great idea for kids, I reckon.
Yeah, it's a great chat. That's coming up a little bit later on. But the main story this morning, Sean, one of my favourite topics, it's all about the property market. But the fall in home prices in capital cities has accelerated during July, with falls in 5 of the 8 capital cities.
Not good news for homeowners, Michael. On average, prices fell by 1.4% last month in Australia's capital cities, though there were bigger drops in Sydney, Melbourne and Hobart. Prices fell 2.2% in Sydney for the 6th monthly decline in a row, with the pace of falls accelerating since the May rate hike. It was the biggest monthly fall since the mid-1980s. Sydney home prices are now down by more than 5% since their February high. Melbourne prices fell 1.5% and are now down 5 months in a row. Hobart also fell back 1.5%. Canberra and Brisbane went backwards last month, while Adelaide, Perth and Darwin experienced small increases. House prices are falling more than unit prices, but of course, they also jumped more during the boom.
Sean, what are the main reasons for the declines? Is it all about interest rates?
Well, it's easy to blame interest rates, but the downward trend, at least in Sydney and Melbourne, started well before rates started to rise. Poor affordability, a rise in new listings, a shift in household spending from goods to services. Many of the things that we spend our money on now weren't actually available during the COVID pandemic, and we're spending more on those services. The cost of living pressures and a collapse in consumer confidence have all contributed to the downturn. But easily the biggest factor right now is rising interest rates, with some fixed rate loans now nearly 3 times the level of last year.
Of course, Sean, the big question really is just how much further will they go?
Well, everyone wants to know the answer to that. Our own resident economist, Stephen Koukoulas, thinks peak to trough, house prices will fall less than 10%. And that's because there's plenty of good stuff going on in the economy at the moment. Think the employment market. People have a job, which is really important. But others disagree. AMP chief economist Shane Oliver reckons it could be closer to 20%. That's a peak to trough drop. He points out that the rise in interest rates has hit harder, faster this time around. Next year could be particularly difficult, given many people will roll off fixed rate loans onto higher variable rate loans. So the prognosis, whichever way you look at it, isn't good. Even the optimists still think there's a way to go in terms of falling house prices. The pessimists say there's still a long way to go.
All right. How did the local equity market go yesterday?
The S&P ASX 200 was up 0.7% to close at 6,993 points. That's 5 straight positive sessions. Some pretty good performers, really. Woodside Energy jumped nearly 3%. CSL, Telstra and QBE were all up around 2%. Woolworths was a strong performer. It rose 1.6%, while BHP, Transurban and Santos all jumped more than 1%. The banks were mixed. Macquarie Group and ANZ actually both fell around 1%. Battery metal miners Alchem and Linus Rare Earths and agribusiness Elders were the best of the top 200 yesterday, all up more than 4%. A strong performer was Deterra Royalties. It's a company which derives income from different royalty streams. It gets a royalty stream from BHP and two others from mineral sands operations, and that's the only income it gets. It's quite an interesting little company, that one. Its share price ended the day up more than 3%, but United Malt Group tumbled 17%. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. Megaport fell 14%, while PointsBet was down 13%.
And what about global markets?
It's a really big week for earnings on Wall Street. That's continuing. So far, profits have been pretty good, but often things get a little bit more problematic as earnings season continues. There's plenty of economic news from around the globe, and what I'm finding interesting is that media are paying a lot more attention to many economies that they normally wouldn't worry about, mostly because of this inflationary environment. So, for example, yesterday, Indonesia's inflation rate hit a 7-year high. Manufacturing figures in India came out. It's growing at its fastest clip in 8 months, or at least the manufacturing sector is, while South Korean figures showed that exports were strong from that economy. It's just really fascinating at the moment to be able to see all this data from around the world. Before I leave global markets, Michael, oil prices have come off just a touch. I'm enjoying the cheaper petrol prices at the moment, I must say.
Oh, it's amazing, isn't it? I managed to get diesel for under $2 a litre, and that's pretty exciting.
Well done, well done. Gold's trading around $1,765 an ounce, and the Aussie dollar is buying almost 70 US cents.
And Sean, you mentioned earnings on Wall Street. If you haven't already, it's well worth going back and having a listen to our interview from yesterday with Josh Gilbert from eToro, all about some of those big companies on Wall Street, from Apple to Tesla right through to Twitter and Snap. It's just a really, really good overview of everything that's going on. That's in the Fear and Greed playlist as well. Anyway, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, Parliament was back yesterday and there was plenty going on. A couple of former leaders showed up for the first time since the election.
Yes, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison and former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce were back in the House for the first time since May. It was a spirited day, Michael, with aged care, energy and power prices, COVID-19, foot and mouth disease and a constitutionally enshrined Indigenous voice all getting a run. Treasurer Jim Chalmers was asked whether the government might apply a windfall tax to the very, very profitable energy companies, like has occurred in the United Kingdom. He said that it wasn't the government's intention. He didn't quite say no.
Ooh, a little bit of wiggle room in that one.
Just a little bit. Both Anthony Albanese and opposition leader Peter Dutton paid tribute to Indigenous musician Archie Roach following his death over the weekend, aged 66 years. And Michael, the latest news poll published by The Australian yesterday shows that 61% of respondents approve of Mr Albanese's performance in his first 2 months. Now, that's the highest of any incoming leader since news poll began in 2015. It is quite the honeymoon for Mr Albanese.
Yeah, sure is. Now, Sean, the competition watchdog has recommended the federal government take steps towards triggering LNG export controls to make sure there's enough supply for the local market.
Yes, this follows all the concerns about blackouts in recent months. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission report says the government should trigger something called the Australian Domestic Gas Security Mechanism in response to an estimated 56 petajoules shortfall in the East Coast market next year if all the gas that could be shipped is sent offshore. Lots of words and all that, but basically that shortfall is about 10% of East Coast domestic market demand, and the ACCC wants big producers to increase supply to the domestic market. Now, Resources Minister Madeleine King came out yesterday and said the government is readying the initial step towards using the mechanism. The producers, not wanting to face mandated sales, obviously have responded, saying there will be no shortfall in supply next year. If nothing else, it does look like there'll be more LNG available for domestic use next year.
Okay. Analysis by mortgage broker Lendy shows that loyal customers are earning the big banks around $4.5 billion amid rising interest rates because they won't change lenders.
Yes, the moral of this story is clear. Shop around, even if you already have a mortgage. According to the Financial Review, the so-called loyalty tax is a result of customer apathy. Customers don't change mortgages, and the big banks know it. So they charge higher rates to customers already on their books. Banks offer potential and new customers lower interest rates to win the business, of course. Now, that cohort of customers, the front end of the book is how they call it, that's the new customers, can get rates almost 1 percentage point below what loyal customers are paying, according to Lendy.
All right, now this is an interesting one, Sean. For months, we have been talking about returning to work in the CBDs. Now, investment bank UBS has predicted that the number of people working in the centre of the big cities will never be the same again.
UBS estimated that the number of people working in CBD offices will be up to 15% lower. The bank expects working from home has become a structural shift because of the COVID experience. Hybrid ways of working are commonplace. Also, big business have flexible working policies, which they never had before. UBS says white-collar workers will only spend an average of 3.6 days a week in the office in the future, compared to 4.2 days previously. That, of course, has significant impact on a number of big businesses, from the real estate investment trusts through to the infrastructure groups like Transurban.
All right, now, Sean, I know we are a national podcast, but this story is pretty extraordinary because the New South Wales government is in a bit of a mess at the moment. The Trade Minister, Stuart Ayres, is under intense pressure to quit, and the Premier, Dominic Perrottet, has just fired the Fair Trading Minister over bullying claims.
Yes, exactly. Now, look, new documents released yesterday show that former Deputy Premier John Barilaro was not the preferred candidate for a $500,000 a year trade post in New York, but was given the job anyway. A panel selection report was edited to boost Mr. Barilaro's credentials and list him as the first choice, and that occurred after he had signed up for the job. Trade Minister Ayres is under fire over that, but refusing to stand down, and so far Premier Perrottet is sticking by him. Meanwhile, the Premier sacked the Fair Trading Minister Eleni Petinos on Sunday night, saying he had received new information over bullying claims which had been made last Friday. He said he had zero tolerance for that. Now, Ms. Petinos denies the allegations, but she has been removed from her job.
Indeed, and part of her portfolio was responsibility for safe work.
Yes, the irony in that one, but they're all allegations at this point.
Absolutely. United Malt, the fourth largest global supplier of malt to the beer and whiskey industry, yesterday announced a profit downgrade, sending its share price down nearly 17%, Sean.
Yes, did you know that we had the fourth largest supplier to the beer and whiskey industry, malt supplier?
No, I didn't know. So that's my thing from today.
That's your lesson for the day. It used to be part of GrainCorp, actually, and it was spun off at the beginning of the pandemic in May 2020. Talk about bad timing. It has struggled ever since, not surprisingly, and another downgrade yesterday. It's been hit with a poor barley crop in North America, meaning it had to import barley to top up volumes to meet its obligations. It's also suffered higher costs due to inflation. Now, United Malt yesterday came out and said it's negotiating price increases with large beer producers in North America. CEO Mark Palmquist said better times are ahead and the current barley crop looks promising. It needs a bit of luck, this company.
Yeah, sure does. Now, Sean, last month, China attacked the AUKUS agreement between Australia, the US and the United Kingdom, saying it could create another nuclear power. But yesterday, the trio hit back.
They did, ahead of a major United Nations conference on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons in New York. The three AUKUS partners released a working paper which basically reaffirmed a commitment not to breach international law through the transfer of radioactive material, and also to establish a verification process for the atomic watchdog. The report said it would be impossible for Australia to convert uranium fueling the planned fleet of submarines into weapons. Under the AUKUS deal, Australia will acquire up to 8 nuclear-powered submarines.
Westpac says the sale of its life insurance arm to a Japanese group will trigger a loss of $1.1 billion in this year's results.
The sale was part of Westpac's efforts to simplify its business. Now, under the deal, the life insurance operations went to TAL Dai-ichi Life Australia, but the group will provide life insurance products to Westpac customers under a 20-year alliance. The sale finalised yesterday, and Westpac no longer underwrites any insurance products. It certainly is a simpler business and is very focused on mortgages. Its share price ended up 0.5% yesterday, which was actually the best of the major four banks.
All right, and in economic news, the manufacturing sector in Australia slowed last month, Sean.
Yes, the Australian Industry Group Australian Performance of Manufacturing Index declined by 1.5 points to 52.5 points. Now, anything over 50 indicates an expansion, but what's happened is the rate of expansion has dropped. Input prices declined for the first time since February 2022. That's good news, but they remain at very high levels, while employment fell, which reflects labour shortage pressures in manufacturing.
All right, moving on to overseas news. One of the biggest geopolitical debates this week is whether US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi will visit Taiwan as she travels through Asia this week.
Beijing has warned against it, and it would be very, very provocative from the US if Ms. Pelosi does visit Taiwan. China, of course, considers that country part of its own territory. Ms. Pelosi held meetings in Singapore yesterday. She'll also stop in Japan, South Korea, and Malaysia. Now, Taiwan has been left out of the official itinerary, but no one's really sure whether she's going to stop or not.
And in China, the property sector accounts for about 1/3 of output, and new figures show sales fell again in July.
Yeah, look, this is very significant for economies like Australia because, as you said, 1/3 of output in China is the property market. If that market collapses, that economy really struggles, and that ain't good for Australia, and particularly for our iron ore exporters who sell to produce infrastructure. Contract sales at China's 100 biggest developers fell 29% during July as buyers nationwide engaged in a mortgage payment boycott, according to the Financial Times. Basically, home buyers aren't making mortgage payments on unfinished housing projects. They fear that the builders will go broke and they'll lose all their money. Total sales in the sector are down 49% during the past 7 months.
All right, now up next is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview, and today, Sean, you're speaking with Brendan Malone from Raise Invest.
Yes, as we mentioned, very innovative ways of getting people to fund investing and micro amounts, very small amounts, but it's just a really fascinating model they have.
Yeah, it sure is. That's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. And Sean, I know that you and I are both now watching the Hockeyroos progress very, very closely following that fantastic review that we received yesterday from Georgia Wilson, who is over in Birmingham playing for the Hockeyroos at the Commonwealth Games.
A great 5-0 win yesterday against South Africa.
That's right. Wasn't that fantastic? And they are next due to play tonight, 6 o'clock tonight against New Zealand. So that one will be a cracker.
Yeah, I think the competition gets a bit hotter from tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. But we certainly will be watching. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Tuesday, the 2nd of August, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast. Join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.